Life Audio.
Welcome to the Untangling Prayer Podcast. I'm Rachel Wojo, and each week we unravel life's knots through prayer. Here you'll find practical wisdom and prayer encouragement to guide you through life's hardest seasons. Join me as we untangle life's messes together, one prayer at a time. Welcome to the Untangling Prayer Podcast. I'm Rachel, and I'm so glad you're here as we dive into some of the deeper questions about prayer. Have you ever felt so overwhelmed that even praying felt like just one more thing you can't handle? Maybe life feels heavy with responsibilities, grief, or uncertainty, and you wonder if God even hears you in the middle of it all. If that sounds familiar, you're not alone, and this episode is for you. Today, we're talking about how to pray when life feels like too much, when you don't have the words, and when you're not even sure if God is listening. This is something I've wrestled with personally and something that I explored deeply in my latest book, Desperate Prayers, Embracing the Power of Prayer in Life's Darkest Moments. If you've ever felt like your prayers were hitting a wall or God seemed silent when you need Him most, this book is for you. It's filled with simple, honest ways to connect with God, even when life feels overwhelming. And that's what we're focusing on today. The good news, you are not alone in your overwhelm. God not only sees you, but invites you to come to Him exactly as you are, tired, burdened, and unsure. Together, we'll explore how simple prayers can lead to peace, how God meets us in our weakest moments, and how even the smallest acts of kindness, whether received or given, can become powerful answers to prayer. So if you've been feeling like you're, at the end of your rope, remember this. God not only wants to be your rescue, but your refill. Let's get started. Our first segment is Questions in Hard Places. And this week's question is, what do I do when life feels so overwhelming that even prayer feels like one more thing I can't handle? When life feels crushingly heavy, even the thought of praying can seem impossible. But here's the truth. Prayer isn't another task on your list. It's the place where you can bring your exhaustion, frustration, and tears. You don't have to come to God with perfect words or a calm heart. You just have to come. Hebrews 4:16 invites us, let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. Notice it says throne of grace. You're not approaching a God who's waiting to critique your words. You're approaching a loving Father who meets you with mercy. When you're overwhelmed, you don't have to have it all together. You just need to bring your honest heart. Even Jesus knew what it was like to feel overwhelmed. Hebrews 5:7 explains to us, during the days of Jesus' life on earth, He offered up prayers and petitions with fervent cries and tears to the one who could save Him from death. And He was heard because of His reverent submission. Jesus, the Son of God, prayed with cries and tears. If He could bring His deepest sorrow to God, so can we. Here's the beautiful part. Hebrews 5, verse 8 and 9. Son though He was, He learned obedience from what He suffered, and once made perfect, He became the source of eternal salvation. Your overwhelm isn't the end of the story. God is working at the middle of it, in the middle of it, shaping your heart, drawing you closer, and offering you grace. So when you feel like you can't pray, remember, you don't need fancy words or long prayers. Just a simple, God, I need you is enough. You are not alone in your overwhelm. God's grace is already meeting you there. Thanks for tuning in to Questions in Hard Places. We'll be right back after this brief word from our sponsors.
Christian parents, what college will prepare your student to compete with the best while encouraging them to love their country and grow in their walk with Christ? Patrick Henry College. Located in Northern Virginia, Patrick Henry College is the place for high-achieving, conservative Christian students. Already a top pre-law college, PHC has another one-of-a-kind program, Economics and Business Analytics. EBA takes your business-minded STEM student and produces a graduate capable of servant leadership at the highest levels. Find out more at phc.edu/EBA.
Thank you for listening in to that word from our sponsors. And now for this week's segment of Pray More, Worry Less encouragement. Overwhelmed? God is not just your rescue, He's your refill. When life feels like it's closing in from every direction, it's easy to believe that feeling overwhelmed is a sign of failure. You might wonder, well, if I were stronger, I wouldn't feel like this, or if my faith were deeper, I'd be able to handle it all. But the truth is, feeling overwhelmed doesn't mean you're weak. It means you're human. And in those moments, God doesn't pull away from you. He leans in closer. Hebrews 4:16 reminds us, "Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need." God isn't asking you to get your act together before coming to Him. He's inviting you to come exactly as you are, tired, burdened, and unsure. And when you do, He doesn't just meet you at your point of desperation. He fills you with what you need to keep going. As I wrote in Desperate Prayers, God not only wants to be your rescue, but your refill. It's one thing to cry out for help when life feels heavy, but God doesn't stop at rescuing you from the storm. He stays with you in it. He fills your heart with peace, your spirit with strength, and your mind with clarity, even when your circumstances have not changed. So how do we lean into that when everything feels just way too much? Here are 3 ways to let God's presence move you from feeling overwhelmed to held. Number 1, rest in God's presence, not your performance. Oh, mercy, I have to remind myself of this often. When life feels like too much, prayer doesn't have to be another task to complete. Psalm 62:1 says, "Truly my soul finds rest in God. My salvation comes from Him." Instead of trying to find the perfect words, simply sit in His presence. Whisper, "Lord, I'm overwhelmed, but I know You are my refuge." Sometimes the most powerful prayer isn't what you say. It's the quiet trust of resting in His love. And number 2, after you begin to rest in God's presence and not your performance, then release the pressure to have it all together. We often think that we have to have it all together to go to God, but He already knows our hearts. Matthew 6:8 tells us, "Your Father knows what you need before you ask Him." So you don't need fancy words or long agendas, just honest ones. Try simple 3-word prayers like, "God help me," "God hold me," "God heal me." These small prayers open the door for God to pour His peace into your heart and for you to release that pressure to have it all together. And after you rest in God's presence and release the pressure to have it all together, remember you are not alone in this battle. Overwhelm isolates us. It makes us feel like no one understands. But God promises in Isaiah 41:10, "Do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God." You're not walking through whatever you are walking through alone. God's presence is constant, even when you feel forgotten. And often He sends people into our lives to remind us of His care. Maybe think of a friend who's been a lifeline in a hard season, or someone you can reach out to today. Being overwhelmed isn't a sign of failure. I have to tell myself that often. It's an invitation to lean into God's strength. When you feel like you can't hold it all together, remember this: God is not just your rescue, He's your refill. He doesn't just pull you out of the storm. He fills you with peace and strength right in the middle of it. This week, reflect on these questions. Where do I need to release the pressure I'm carrying? How can I rest in God's presence today, even for a few minutes? And who has God placed in my life to help me remember that I'm not alone? This week, our answered prayer story for the final segment of the podcast episode is about a backyard fire and a simple meal. When we're overwhelmed, it's easy to feel isolated, like no one sees or understands the weight we're carrying. I often preach this to my own heart. Sometimes God sends us exactly what we need through the simple kindness of others, especially when we don't know how to ask for help. Just last week, I was on a business call with a friend about something as ordinary as insurance. But as we wrapped up, he paused and said, "This call feels like a full circle moment for me." I wasn't sure exactly what he meant until he took me back 5 years. At that time, I was working at a church, and so was he. He was young, living in an apartment his parents had helped him settle into, trying to begin to navigate life on his own. And suddenly, he lost his job at that church. No job, no clear direction, miles from home, and only 2 weeks to figure out, what do I do next? He had made a mistake, and he felt overwhelmed, alone, and unsure of his future. I remember hearing about what happened and feeling a nudge in my spirit, the one that whispers, reach out. So I did. I invited him over for a simple Friday night dinner with our family, and we sat around in our backyard around the fire pit. The flames were flickering in the cool evening air while we talked about life, mistakes, and moving forward. And I told him, no matter what happened, if you were my son, I'd want someone to reach out, feed you a meal, and remind you that things can still work out. This isn't the end of your story. It was just one evening, one conversation, but sometimes the smallest moments carry the most weight. Fast forward to today, he's now married with a little girl. A few months ago, his wife asked him what moment had been pivotal in his decision to change, to step into the man he is today. Without hesitation, he told her. It was that night around the fire when Rachel reminded me that I wasn't alone and my story wasn't over. When he shared that with me on the phone last week, I realized something powerful. We don't always see how God uses us in the moment, but He is always working through our simplest prayers and acts of kindness. That dinner wasn't just a meal. It was an answer to a silent, overwhelmed prayer he didn't know how to even pray at that time. So if you're feeling overwhelmed today, wondering if your small prayers or even your small actions matter, remember this. God meets us in our overwhelm through small, quiet moments. He might send someone to offer a word of encouragement or meal when you least expect it, or He might use you to be that person for someone else. When life feels too heavy, you don't have to carry it alone. God not only wants to be your rescue, but your refill. Sometimes that refill comes through a backyard fire, a shared meal, or a gentle reminder that your story isn't over. This story of answered prayer is similar to many testimonies I share in my latest book, Desperate Prayers, Embracing the Power of Prayer in Life's Darkest Moments. If you're in a season where you're wondering if God hears you, this book will offer comfort. Desperate Prayers is available now. The ebook and audiobook of Desperate Prayers is available as well. Order your copy at desperateprayers.com or wherever you buy books. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Untangling Prayer. I'm Rachel Wojo. May you feel the reminder today that God sees you, He hears you, and He knows your needs. Thanks for joining me on the Untangling Prayer podcast. If this episode resonated with you, share it with someone who could use a little hope. And be sure to subscribe for more. Until next time, keep seeking, keep trusting, and keep praying.
Finding uplifting news in today's headlines is often like searching for a needle in a haystack. At the Story Behind podcast, we believe in the power of finding heartwarming tales and are happy to share empowering stories with you every week. Hear about how Steve Harvey surprised a dying man on Family Feud with $25,000. Get inspired by the note a waitress received from a patron dining alone. And even hear about how one VIP passenger made a hardworking pilot get emotional before his flight. To start listening to the Story Behind podcast, visit lifeaudio.com or search Story Behind on your favorite podcast platform.